Off the southern coast of France, 37 meters beneath the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, there is a hole in a limestone cliff that nobody was supposed to find. It leads into a flooded tunnel 175 meters long, pitch black, barely wide enough for a single diver to pass through. 3 people have died inside it. The tunnel slopes upward through absolute darkness until the water breaks and you surface inside a chamber that has been sealed from the outside world for roughly 9,000 years. What is inside that chamber is not empty. It is not quiet. It is covered, floor to ceiling, in the work of people who should not exist in this location, in this time period, painting subjects that do not belong in any Ice Age cave ever documented on Earth, 500 individual paintings and engravings, 65 handprints pressed into the stone by people whose fingers appear to be missing, an image of a man with a spear driven through his skull, and animals that have no business appearing on the walls of a cave in southern France, creatures from the deep ocean painted by people who lived on grassland 6 kilometers from the nearest shoreline. This is not Lascaux, it is not Chauvet. Those caves are famous because they were easy to find and easy to explain. This one is famous because it was impossible to reach and nearly impossible to believe. The cave was sealed by the planet itself. Rising oceans swallowed the entrance at the end of the last ice age and locked it behind a wall of seawater that would stand undisturbed for 90 centuries. No human being set foot inside it during that entire span. And when someone finally did, what they found waiting in the dark changed the way researchers understand who we were, what we were capable of, and what we were willing to do to each other 27,000 years before anyone alive today was born. My name is Simon, and this story has never been told the way it needs to be told. Here is what the ocean was hiding. The man who found this place was not a scientist. He was not an archaeologist. He was not working on a grant or following a theory. Henri Cosquer was a professional deep-sea diver from the town of Cassis, near Marseille. In 1985, he was diving in the Calanques, a dramatic stretch of limestone cliffs that drops straight into the Mediterranean along the coast of southeastern France. He knew these waters. He had dived them for years. At a depth of roughly 37 meters, about 121 feet below the surface, near a feature called Cap Morgiou, he noticed a cavity in the rock that he had never explored. It was narrow. The visibility was poor. Most divers would have noted it and moved on. Cosquer did not move on. He followed it inward. That single decision started a chain of events that would take 6 years, cost 3 lives, nearly destroy one man's reputation, and produce a discovery so disorienting that some of the most respected prehistorians in France initially refused to believe it was real. But that was later. In 1985, Cosquer simply wanted to know where the tunnel went. He swam into the passage alone and discovered that it did not dead end. It kept going. The gallery stretched deeper and deeper into the cliff face, narrow in places, barely passable, always dark. Over the next several years, Cosquer returned again and again, each time pushing a little further, laying guideline behind him, testing the limits of his equipment and his nerve. During one solo dive deep inside the passage, his lamp failed. He was left in total darkness inside a submerged tunnel with no way to see how far he had come or how far he had left to go. He had to feel his way back along the guideline, meter by meter, in pitch-black water, with no margin for error. He later admitted the experience had shaken him deeply enough to make him reconsider whether he should keep going. He kept going. By 1990, Cosquer understood he could not finish this alone. The passage was too long, the risk too high, and the distance too great for a single diver operating without support. He brought in 2 Belgian cave divers, brothers named Bernard and Mark van Espen. Following Cosquer's directions, they swam carefully through the tunnel, staying low to avoid disturbing the fine silt on the floor. Even a minor disturbance would turn the water completely opaque and strand a diver with zero visibility hundreds of meters from open ocean. They reached an underground lake with a pocket of trapped air sitting just above the water's surface, a strong indication that dry, unflooded space existed somewhere beyond. Their guideline ran out before they could confirm it. They had to turn back. In June 1991, Mark van Espen returned and installed the final stretch of guideline. On July 9th of that year, Cosquer went back with his niece, Sandrine Cosquer, and 2 friends, Jan Goguen and Pascal Auriol. They made it through the flooded passage and surfaced inside the dry chambers for the first time. What they found stopped them where they stood. Markings on the walls. Cosquer's first reaction was not excitement. He later said his immediate thought was that someone had come down and spray-painted graffiti on the rock, because the idea of genuine prehistoric art sitting inside a cave that could only be reached by scuba equipment seemed too strange to even consider. It took time for the reality to settle. What they were looking at was not modern vandalism. It had been sitting untouched in that chamber, in the dark, in total silence, for tens of thousands of years. They took photographs. They made more dives through July and August, documenting more paintings, more engravings, more handprints pressed into the stone in red and black pigment. Then came September 1st, 1991. Word of the discovery had started to circulate informally among the diving community near Marseille. 3 divers from the city of Grenoble, operating on their own without Cosker's guidance, entered the underwater passage to see the cave for themselves. They became lost inside the 775-meter tunnel. They never found the exit. All 3 died in the darkness, hundreds of meters from open water. Kosker and Gauguin took part in recovering the bodies. The experience was devastating. 2 days later, on September 3rd, 1991, Kosker formally reported the cave to France's Maritime Affairs Department in Marseille. What had been one diver's private obsession for 6 years became, overnight, a matter for the French state. A discovery that should have been one of the great moments in the history of archaeology arrived wrapped in tragedy, and the scientific community's first response was not wonder, it was suspicion. France has more decorated Ice Age caves than any other country on Earth, but every single one of them, before Kosker, had been found west of the Rhône River. No one had ever discovered anything like this east of the Rhône, in the Provence region. That geographic surprise alone was enough to make several of the most prominent prehistorians in France publicly question whether the paintings were genuine. The skepticism grew louder as details reached the press. Critics pointed to images on the walls that looked like penguins, an animal no one expected to see in French Ice Age art. They pointed to hand stencils that appeared to have fingers deliberately removed. They pointed to the lower edges of painted horses lining up with the cave's current waterline in a way that seemed too convenient. Some of the criticism played out publicly in international newspapers, where questions were raised about whether the entire site might be an elaborate forgery staged inside a cave nobody could reach to verify. The doubts had a structural problem. Authenticating the cave required an expert who could personally examine the paintings. But almost no archaeologist specializing in the Paleolithic period had the diving skill required to reach a chamber 37 meters underwater through a narrow, dark, silt-covered tunnel that had already killed 3 people. French authorities eventually turned to Jean Courtin, an archaeologist whose expertise was closer to the Neolithic period because he was one of the only qualified researchers physically capable of making the dive. In September 1991, Courtin led an expedition aboard a research vessel called the Argonaut, joined by cave art specialist Jean Klotz. Klotz was not yet a diver at that time. He had first seen Kosker's photographs while working at the Ministry of Culture and found them compelling enough that he eventually learned to scuba dive at the age of 69, specifically so he could study this cave in person. He went on to make dozens of visits over the following years, regularly canceling trips due to rough seas and dangerous conditions, returning each time to a chamber that the ocean was slowly reclaiming. Courtin authenticated the site in 1991. The paintings and engravings were genuinely ancient, not a modern forgery, not a hoax staged inside a hard-to-reach cave. The confirmation raised an immediate and far more unsettling question. If these paintings were real, if they were tens of thousands of years old, how did an ancient art gallery end up sitting at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea? The answer required stepping outside the present entirely. During the last glacial period, the world along this stretch of coastline looked nothing like it does today. Sea levels sat as much as 100 to 120 meters lower than their current position. Enormous volumes of the planet's water were locked in glaciers and ice sheets. The Mediterranean shoreline was several kilometers further south. The cave did not sit underwater. It sat roughly 6 kilometers inland, overlooking a wide-open steppe-like landscape, no ocean anywhere near it. The people who entered this cave to paint its walls walked in on dry ground through an entrance that stood more than 100 meters above the waterline. They carried pigment, torches, stone tools, and a calcite plaque that researchers believe functioned as a lamp filled with animal fat to provide light in chambers that would have otherwise sat in complete darkness. Around 10,000 years ago, during the warming period known as the Holocene, glaciers began melting rapidly and sea levels rose across the globe. The Mediterranean coastline crept steadily inland over thousands of years until it swallowed the valley in front of the cave entirely. Then it kept rising until it submerged the entrance itself, cutting off any dry access by roughly 9,000 years ago. The cave was not deliberately hidden by anyone. It was slowly drowned by a changing planet, sealed behind a barrier of seawater instead of collapsed stone. And that is what makes the forgery argument collapse completely. You cannot fake an underwater seal created by 9,000 years of rising ocean. It is a lock that no human being could have set. When researchers finally established a reliable timeline for the cave using radiocarbon dating, the results landed in two distinct clusters. The first centered around 27,000 years ago, the second around 19,000 years ago. Over 60 separate radiocarbon tests were eventually run on 41 different samples, confirming a long span of human visits, stretching from roughly 33,000 years ago down to about 19,000 years ago, made up of two major, nearly continuous phases of occupation. That timeline means this cave was first visited at roughly the same period as the famous Chauvet Cave further north. Its final visitors overlapped with the era of the artists working at Lascaux. Two entirely separate cultures, separated by roughly 8,000 years, using different tools and different techniques, both chose this same difficult-to-reach cave to create their art. Nobody has been able to explain why. Whether the second group knew anything at all about the images the first group had left behind in the dark is a question that has no answer and may never have one. What they painted is where the story stops matching anything researchers expected to find. Most famous Ice Age caves in France, including Lascaux and Chauvet, are covered in horses, bison, mammoths, and other land animals that lived across the open plains and forests of Ice Age Europe. The walls of this cave tell a different story. Alongside horses, ibex, chamois, and the extinct giant deer known as Megaloceros, the cave contains images of seals, multiple seals painted in detail by people who lived kilometers from the ocean. It contains images of birds that every visitor who first saw them described as penguins. Those birds were almost certainly not true penguins. Penguins have never existed anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Researchers who studied the images believe the artists were painting the great auk, a large flightless seabird that once thrived across the North Atlantic and looked remarkably similar to a small penguin, complete with a black and white body built for swimming rather than flying. The great auk went extinct in 1844, hunted out of existence by human beings, which makes this cave one of the only places on Earth where you can see one memorialized in ochre and charcoal by people who watched it dive through frigid Mediterranean waters 19 years before anyone thought to give it a name. The cave also contains markings that some researchers believe represent jellyfish or octopi, adding marine life to a gallery that should, by every other example from this era, have stayed firmly on dry land. There are roughly 500 individual paintings and engravings inside this cave representing 11 different species, alongside around 200 separate geometric signs scattered across the walls, whose meaning nobody has been able to determine. The full count includes 177 animal drawings, 63 horses, 28 ibex, 17 deer, 10 bison, 7 aurochs, 16 marine animals, including 9 seals and 3 great auks. Deep inside the cave, past the point where the flooded tunnel finally gives way to dry ground, the ceiling suddenly rises to a full 30 meters in the final chamber. Along one stretch of wall sits what researchers now call the panel of horses, a dense concentration of imagery so tightly packed and so precisely rendered that it represents one of the largest single collections of horse figures found in any decorated cave in France. That panel sits alongside engraved crosses cut directly into the stone, simple geometric marks whose purpose remains as unclear as every other sign system in this cave. Whether these crosses functioned as counting marks, territorial signals, calendar notation, or something tied to belief systems now completely lost to history is something researchers have not been able to determine from the physical evidence alone. The geometric signs are not what silenced the research teams. The hands are what silenced them. Among the earliest artwork inside the cave sit dozens of hand stencils made by pressing a hand flat against the rock and blowing pigment around it, leaving a ghostly outline behind. There are at least 65 individual stencils across the cave, made in both red and black pigment. A computer analysis conducted on the stencils suggested that many of them were made by women. The hands are not remarkable in themselves. Hand stencils appear in caves across Europe, across Africa, across Australia, across Southeast Asia. What is remarkable is what is missing from these hands. A striking number of the stencils appear to show one or more fingers absent. In nearly every case, the thumb is shown fully intact. The other fingers are the ones that disappear. This exact pattern repeats at other caves tied to the same Gravettian culture that produced the earliest art in this cave. At the Gargas cave in the French Pyrenees, 114 of 231 hand stencils are missing at least one finger segment. At Maltreviso in Spain, 61 of 71 hand images show the same pattern. The pattern is too widespread and too consistent to be random. Researchers have proposed competing explanations. Some argue the fingers were simply bent down out of view rather than physically missing, a deliberate gesture similar to how you might fold fingers to create a shadow puppet. A study published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society found that every hand shape at Gargas was reproducible in the air without using the wall as support, suggesting the configurations were part of a known system in everyday use, a Stone Age sign language. Others point to frostbite, since the specific pattern of damage, sparing the thumb while shortening the other fingers, closely matches how frostbite actually destroys human hands in extreme cold. These people lived through one of the most brutal climate periods in European history. The temperatures were not theoretical, they were survivable, only barely. Then there is the theory that refuses to go away. Archaeologist Mark Collard of Simon Fraser University and his colleague Bria Macaulay examined over 200 hand images with missing fingertips from caves in France and Spain. Their conclusion, presented at a meeting of the European Society for Human Evolution, was that the evidence most consistently supports deliberate ritual amputation. They cross-referenced examples present in over 100 cultures across all continents and found that finger removal appeared repeatedly as a religious sacrificial practice or a social ritual that strengthened bonds within a group while fostering hostility toward outsiders. Collard stated it directly. There is compelling evidence that these people may have had their fingers amputated deliberately in rituals intended to elicit help from supernatural entities. In Paleolithic cave art, researchers have long observed that the art tends to appear in dark, hard-to-reach parts of caves, consistent with spaces designed for rituals that were not comfortable and not meant to be witnessed by everyone. If Collard's theory is correct, the handprints inside this cave are not casual marks left by visitors passing through. They are the signatures of people who paid a permanent physical price to enter a space they considered sacred enough to justify mutilation. Nobody has settled which explanation is correct, and the hands are not the most disturbing human traces on these walls. Cave art from this period almost never shows recognizable human figures. Painters from this era overwhelmingly chose animals, geometric signs, and hand stencils. Full human bodies are left almost entirely out of the picture across nearly every major site in Europe. This cave breaks that pattern with two engravings that researchers have studied extensively and remain deeply uncomfortable discussing. One shows a figure that combines the lower body of a seal with the upper body of a man, a hybrid, half animal, half human, the kind of image that suggests the boundary between species was not experienced by these people the way it is experienced now. Something about the relationship between humans and seals in this coastal environment was close enough, familiar enough, or frightening enough that an artist felt compelled to fuse the two into a single body on the wall of a chamber 37 meters below the modern sea. The second engraving is worse. Researchers who first documented it named it the Killed Man. It depicts a human figure with what appears to be a spear or projectile driven through its skull. The archaeologists who authored the definitive account of this cave, Jean Clates and Jean Courtin, described the image as resembling a murder or execution. Nobody knows what story it was meant to tell. It could represent a hunting accident, it could be a symbolic warning. It could depict a ritual scene or a real event. What is certain is that 27,000 years ago, deep inside a cave that required a dangerous journey to reach, someone took the time to engrave an image of a human being killed by another human being. In a period of art history where human figures are almost non-existent, the one human body depicted in full inside this cave is shown in the act of dying violently. That image has been sitting in the dark, underwater, for 9,000 years. And the question it raises is not whether violence existed in the Paleolithic. The question is why the record of that violence was placed here in this specific chamber alongside animals and handprints and geometric signs that no one alive can read. There is a detail about this cave that almost never makes it into the public discussion, and it is the one that should keep every researcher awake. 4/5 of the cave's total surface area is now permanently underwater. The paintings and engravings that survive today, all 500 of them, exist only on the upper walls of the chambers that remained above the rising waterline. Everything below that line has been dissolved, eroded, or destroyed by seawater across 9,000 years of submersion. The artwork the world knows about represents, at best, 1/5 of what was originally created. If every surface within reach of the artists was used, and the evidence in the surviving sections strongly suggests it was, then a considerable number of works have already been lost forever. Nobody knows what was on those lower walls. Nobody knows what species were painted there, what scenes were depicted, what signs were carved into stone that the Mediterranean has since eaten away to nothing. The legs of one painted horse near the current waterline have already disappeared, swallowed by the sea, whose level also varies with the tides by more than 15 centimeters. What remains exists on borrowed time. In 2011, researchers Mikkel Olive and Luc Van Rel raised the alarm after documenting rapid damage to several images caused by accelerating sea level rise. The situation was described as a catastrophe by the archaeological team. Van Rel recalled the psychological impact of witnessing the destruction of the horse drawings in particular. At a rate of approximately 3 millimeters per year, the effects are now visible on every research dive. Microplastic pollution in the water is accelerating the degradation further. The French Ministry of Culture responded by commissioning a $24 million full-scale replica called Cosquer Méditerranée, built by the same firm responsible for the Chauvet Cave replica. It opened in Marseille in June 2022. Visitors enter through simulated exploration pods designed to recreate the sensation of surfacing from underwater into the dry chambers. Meanwhile, teams of specially trained diver archaeologists under scientific director Cyril Montoya continue structured research campaigns inside the real cave, racing to digitally scan every surviving image before the sea takes it. In March 1992, researchers discovered a second entrance into the cave system, entirely separate from the original underwater passage Cosquer had followed. French authorities chose to keep its location completely secret. That decision held for more than 30 years. The reasoning was straightforward. Publishing the location of a second way into one of the most fragile archaeological sites on the planet would make it nearly impossible to secure. The artwork inside had already survived 27,000 years underwater. Uncontrolled human visitors could destroy it in a single afternoon. So the second entrance was sealed from public knowledge, its coordinates classified, its existence acknowledged only in the most restricted research literature. For 3 decades, one of the most significant caves in the history of human civilization had a hidden door that the people responsible for protecting it decided the world was not ready to know about. Here is what adds up when you hold every piece of this story at the same time. 2 separate groups of human beings, separated by 8,000 years, traveled to the same difficult, dangerous, deliberately inconvenient location to make art. They painted animals they hunted and animals they feared. They pressed mutilated hands against the walls in patterns that may represent the earliest sign language ever documented or the physical evidence of rituals so severe they required the permanent sacrifice of fingers. They engraved a hybrid creature that was half human and half seal, and a man being killed by a weapon through the skull. They built fires inside a chamber so deep and so dark that reaching it required carrying everything, fuel, pigment, tools, light, through passages that offered no margin for error. And then, when they were finished, they left. They did not return. The ocean rose behind them and sealed every trace of what they had done beneath a wall of water that would stand undisturbed for 90 centuries. Nobody chose to hide this cave. The planet did it on its own. And the fact that the planet is now undoing what it did, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, means that the same force that preserved this place is now destroying it. The sea that kept the cave sealed is the sea that is washing its contents away. The artwork is dissolving, the handprints are fading, the killed man is losing resolution with every tide cycle. Whatever was painted on the 4/5 of the walls that are already underwater is gone and cannot be recovered by any technology that currently exists. Geologist Jacques Collina-Gerard has described the digital scans being assembled by Van Rel's team as a preserved memory of a place the sea will eventually reclaim entirely. That sentence deserves a moment. A preserved memory, not a preserved place. The distinction is intentional. The cave itself is not going to survive. What will survive is a digital ghost, accurate to within millimeters, of a space that once held the oldest record of marine life ever painted by human hands, the oldest evidence of a communication system built from the shapes of broken fingers, and the only known depiction in all of Ice Age European art of one human being killing another. The original cave stays sealed behind seawater and strict access limits. The public will never enter it. Most researchers will never enter it. The replica in Marseille is a $24 million reproduction built to survive for centuries. The real cave was built by people who had nothing but pigment, animal fat, and firelight, and it survived for 27,000 years until the ocean began to take it back. There is a question that nobody working on this site has been able to answer. Why here? Why did two separate cultures, 8,000 years apart, choose this specific cave? There are dozens of large caves in the Calanques. Some of them were certainly lived in during the same periods. Several probably contained art of their own before the Mediterranean swallowed them entirely, erasing whatever was painted on their walls without leaving a trace. The fact that this particular cave survived is an accident of geology. The angle of its passage, the height of its chambers, the specific rate at which the water rose, a slightly different configuration, and every painting inside would have been dissolved centuries ago. The entire record would have vanished as if it had never existed. How many other caves along the Mediterranean coast held paintings that are now gone? How many other galleries, other handprints, other killed men, other hybrid figures were created by people whose work was erased by the same ocean that is currently erasing this one? The answer is that nobody knows. What researchers do know is that the probability of a single cave surviving intact through 9,000 years of submersion while every comparable site around it was destroyed is extremely low. This cave was not the only one. It was almost certainly the last one left, and it is disappearing right now. Not in centuries, not in decades, right now. Every research dive documents new damage. Every tidal cycle moves the waterline a fraction higher. The legs of the horses are already gone. The lower handprints are submerged. Whatever was painted on 4/5 of the walls has been erased without record. The oldest known depiction of marine life created by human hands. The earliest potential evidence of a prehistoric sign language pressed in pigment onto stone. The only image in all of European Ice Age art showing a human being killed by a weapon. A chamber visited across 14,000 years by people willing to walk for kilometers through open steppe, climb into darkness, burn animal fat in stone lamps, and press broken hands against walls in a ritual whose meaning died with every person who ever performed it, all of it. Sitting 37 meters beneath the Mediterranean. Dissolving. The question is not whether the cave will be lost. The researchers have already accepted that it will. The question is what else was on those walls that nobody will ever see, what was painted on the surfaces that the sea has already taken. What message was pressed into the stone by hands we will never identify, in a language we will never read, inside a chamber that the ocean sealed for 9,000 years and is now, slowly, permanently, erasing from the record of human existence as if it was never there at all. If something about this story unsettled you, leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe, because the deeper researchers go into what the ocean is hiding, the less comfortable the answers become. And there are caves along every coastline on Earth that no one has opened yet.